Hey guys, what's going on? Excoundrel here. Today we're going to be looking at a composition called BRAWLERS Blasters. It is a super strong composition with two main variations, and we're going to go through each of those individually. Now, if you like this content, please feel free to like and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what kind of composition you'd like to see me cover. I'm aiming to be as beginner-friendly as possible with my explanations, because I know there are a lot of people that have come from Auto Chess Mobile, and if you're not a new player and you are a veteran to TFT, feel free to offer advice down in the comments as well. I really don't take anything personally. I'm not a new player to TFT. I'm obviously more of an auto chess specialist, but I have played a lot of set 2 and I'm coming into set 3 and I'm really enjoying it, which is why I'm making these guides. BRAWLERS Blasters, core champions. I would say that Ezreal and Lucian are kind of interchangeable and can be swapped out for Graves, but I just put down the core champions that I like to use in the both versions, which is Lucian, Jinx, Misfortune, Blitzcrank, and Cho'Gath, all of which I think are fairly good to keep in across the board. I think Blitzcrank is an incredibly useful unit even in the late game, and Cho'Gath just provides a lot of really good CC. You can bring Graves in for Ezreal or Graves in for Lucian, and I'll talk about the kind of complexities of that decision in the longer explanation when I go to the positioning and stuff. And I would replace Malphite and Vi for Shen and Thresh, or Shen and Wukong if you can't find Thresh, to look for the 4 Chrono version, because there is 2 major versions of this build. The top version is the 4 Brawler, 4 Blasters, and the bottom version is 2 Brawlers, 4 Chrono, 4 Blasters. I prefer Brawlers Blasters with just 4 Brawlers and 4 Blasters, because I think that the Chrono version takes too long to come online and fights are much too quick rather to make use of the scaling attack speed. When it comes to items that you want to get from the carousel, you're looking for BF Sword, Recurve Bow, Chain Vest, Giant's Belt, but also Tear for Misfortune, and major items that you want are Giant Slayer, GA, Red Buff, and Seraphs. But I'll talk about greater itemization in just a moment, but both of those itemization choices apply to both the Chrono and the Brawler version, because your items are mostly going on Jinx and Misfortune. Hey guys, so I want to talk a little bit about early game Brawlers Blasters. So there's a few different ways you can approach the early game. I don't really think there's a particularly best way to do it, but I think it just depends on what you find. For instance, if you find a Graves and get him to 2-star early on, he's obviously a blaster and a space pirate, so you can play a game, and which I'll show you what I did, where you play around Graves being a space pirate to try and accelerate your advantage. So what you either do is you go Graves. If you find a Malphite, that's great as well, get him to 2-star, and then you can add in something like a Darius, and that gives you 2 space pirates. I usually do it something like this. Graves over here. This gives you 2 space pirates, which will give you the potential to find extra gold, and then also gives you a brawler. And then at level 4, you bring in Lucian to give yourself, and get him to 2-star if you can, to give yourself 2 blasters, or that can be replaced by an Ezreal. So basically, it's either Ezreal or Lucian, but obviously Lucian's slightly easier to get to 2-star, and also can do well with items too. If you can't find a Darius, or rather, I should phrase this, if you actually find a Jace, I actually think Jace is better than Darius, because he does more damage with his abilities, so it's more likely that you're going to get gold if you're running something like this. So this would be an amazing start for Brawlers and Blasters. There are 2 things that you can do. If you get items, you can actually give them to Graves, because you could sell Graves later on. Sometimes if you snowball Graves, you might not want to give Graves items, because you might want to keep him as kind of a frontline blaster tank. But Graves in general is just very, very strong. I think he's a really, really good one cost unit, and I think in blasters especially, this makes him very, very strong. So what you can do then from this point forward is, this is like level 4, right? So now we're going to be thinking about going to level 5 and level 6. When we get to level 5 and level 6, we're going to want to add the Blitzcrank. The Blitzcrank will give you the ability to pull someone in. Let's say we separate these guys out a bit. It will also give you the Brawler bonus for your Malphite. You could even pull the Blitzcrank over here and try and get them to sort of be with a Jace. You could even put the Jace back here and just have these 2 guys at the front with the Lucian in the middle. This is a way that you could set this up. You then have the option to go Chrono and add, for instance, where is it? Ezreal. So you could add Ezreal here. And this is how I would run like my mid-game a lot of the time. This would be my mid-game composition. I would have Ezreal and Lucian as my blasters. I'd probably put Ezreal over in the corner and Lucian in the middle. But Ezreal and Lucian as blasters. I've got two brawlers, and I have also the space pirate to get myself the gold. As soon as you find Jinx, ditch Jace or ditch Darius, whichever one you've got, and then you're going to add Jinx to the lineup, because Jinx would give you your 4 blasters. So now you have 4 blasters, which is a very, very strong mid game. You have the tankiness of the Graves and the Malphite. You could even add, I guess you could put Ezreal next to the Blitzcrank, and this is the way you'd do it. So then item-wise, the items that you're going to want to be giving over to Jinx as a primary would be things like the Giant Slayer. It's very strong. I would also be thinking of giving her red buff, if I can find that. Red buff is super strong. Guardian Angel. This is like a really, really good 1, 2, 3 on your Jinx. However, now I'm going to go through items that would work well on Jinx otherwise. So these items, you might not get them, right? You might not get those items. Infinity Edge works perfectly well on Jinx. Gwynsu's Rage Blade works perfectly fine on Jinx. You could give her Trap Claw as a defensive, works perfectly fine on Jinx. What else would work well on Jinx? Bloodthirster works fine on Jinx if you want it. Let's have a look elsewhere. I think Static Shiv, if you're desperate, is not particularly good, but it will work if you need it to on Jinx. Yeah, those are mostly the items that work really nicely on Jinx. Hand of Justice can work as well. Hand of Justice is generally a pretty solid item, so you can put that on the Jinx if you want. I usually give it to my Lucian, just because he's a pretty good carry with it, but yeah, you can put it on the Jinx if you want, but primarily, like, the ultimate combo is something like GA, Giant Slayer, and red buff. For GA, I sometimes, if my Jinx is really well protected, I might go for something like this with the Gwynsu's Rage Blade, and this just makes your Jinx super, super, super powerful. So then we're looking towards the late game. Now, obviously, we're going to have to just start doing some switching here, because eventually your Graves is, unless you get your Graves to 3-star, I would never consider keeping Graves. If you get your Graves to 3-star, I'd sometimes consider dropping the Lucian or the Ezreal. Depends what you're most concerned about. If you keep the Ezreal, you're going to keep Chrono, which can actually be moderately useful. So sometimes I would drop the Lucian. In the game that I show you, I drop the Lucian because I actually get my Graves to 3-star. But let's just say we're playing an average game, and we're going to play the Brawler variation of this build. So we would drop Graves here, and then we would find Cho'Gath, who we want to get to 2-star as soon as possible, and we'd also find Vi, who we'd want to get to 2-star as soon as possible. Kind of want Cho'Gath in the middle just so he can deal damage there. And then you are going to then add, this is level 8 right here, so we've got 4 blasters, but obviously we want to start to think about getting Misfortune now. So Misfortune would be our final addition here, and that would be our level 8 composition. Misfortune, 2-star as soon as possible. Really, one core item for Misfortune would be the Seraphs. So you talked about it in the game previously, like getting Seraphs for Misfortune is incredibly important. Otherwise, she just works well with pretty much any old item. You know, things like Giant Slayer, a little bit like Jinx. She works fine with Gwynsu's Rage Blade, like Jinx. Honestly, just anything beyond this point is perfectly fine. Trap Claw works perfectly fine on her as well, but just a Seraphs on her is going to help you out so much, because it's going to get her ability up and running. I actually sometimes put Thief's Gloves on her, because they, you know, if you don't have enough items left over, Thief's Gloves would work perfectly fine on Misfortune. So this is actually just the Brawler. The Brawler variation. You want your Misfortune in the corner away from your Blitzcrank, because it's going to pull someone in away from Misfortune, and you want her to have her cone hitting the majority of the board. But let's say you don't want to run this variation of the build, you want to run the Chrono variation of the build. So the Chrono variation of the build, you've got a couple of options. You're going to want to keep... you're probably going to drop the Malphite, so you drop one of the Brawlers being the Malphite, as long as he's not 3-star, and then you're going to bring in Shen, who you definitely want to get to 2-star as quickly as possible, and then obviously you're going to want to get another Chrono, the best Chrono in my opinion being Thresh, and then I would drop Vi for Thresh in this instance. You probably put Thresh a little bit further up like this, and this is how you'd run it, something similar to this, and that would be your Chrono variation. You can also play Jinx in a corner over here, something like this. Just trying to keep your Jinx as safe as possible, and actually I would recommend doing something like that to put your Blitzcrank further away. You can put your Jinx in like a super safe corner position like this, just to keep her as safe as possible here as well. That's another way that you can play these kind of positioning. But a lot of the time playing Jinx at the back is perfectly fine. When it comes to 3-star priorities, honestly, in this particular composition, there's no massive 3-star priorities, but if you can get a 3-star Lucian, that's fine. Jinx is really hard to 3-star. There isn't anyone that's like super easy to 3-star. In the other variation, Malphite is like a good 3-star, Graves is a good 3-star, so those would be your 3-star options. But in this case, it's just basically the 2 stars are good enough. enough. You really aren't going to find many other opportunities to 3-star. Blitzcrank maybe, Ezreal maybe, and Shen maybe in this particular variation, right? So those are the 2 variations that you can play. Let's go through a game. I'm going to do more game commentary this time round just to see if you guys like it. And if you do like it, we'll try and do that a bit more often. I'm not going to skip as much throughout the game. I'm going to talk about my sort of my thought process throughout it. So what I've done is I've sped up this game to 2 times speed. I think that 2 times speed is a good enough speed for you guys to follow what's going on. But otherwise, if it's not, then please let me know. But I think 2 times speed is pretty easy to understand. So what we've got here is a Graves with a chain vest. I actually ended up finding a 2-star Graves on the next shop. Graves is a really, really good early unit for Brawlers because he's a for Blasters, because he's a blaster. So you're going to be able to get the blaster bonus. But B, he's a space pirate. And that's, like, a space pirate is just a really strong early synergy because it can get you like a gold snowball going on, especially if you get something like a Jace alongside a 2-star Graves. You can get a lot of extra gold just by having those 2 units on the field by themselves. I'm having a quick look at what everyone else is picking up because by round 3, you might get an indication about what people are putting on their benches. I actually end up going for a Bramble Vest on my Graves. I pick up 2 more Graves. So this is going to be a very special game of Brawlers Blasters where I'm actually running like a tank Graves because I'm actually over halfway to a 3-star Graves by round 4 or round 2-1, which is incredibly strong. I take off the Zoe for another Graves. This is because everybody on my lineup is now a space pirate, and obviously if anybody gets one of the last hits, we could end up getting ourselves some extra gold, which is very, very useful for the early game, not only for hitting gold thresholds and snowballing your gold income, but also for buying extra units from the shop to potentially increase the chances of 2-stars. I also then find another 2-star Graves, which is just absolutely ludicrous. Now, I did actually sell a Malphite early on. That's because, as you can see, I'm hoarding poppies. Now, why am I hoarding poppies? For the simple fact that I could potentially run this composition into a Space Pirate Vanguard composition with Jace. So I'm keeping the poppies around because it keeps my options open. And that's one of the beautiful things about getting a Graves start with a Blaster composition is that you don't actually have to go Blasters with Graves. He works in a Jace composition with Vanguards. So you could, if you want to go back and watch my video from 2 days ago, you can see how to build a Jace composition. Well, by having Graves on the field, especially at 2-star, you can actually build the units that you need for Jace, which is Vanguards, and then pick up Jace and a Vanguard start towards the mid game, like level 4 and 5, and that would be really, really strong as well. So I'm just randomly selling and buying units depending on what I think would fit this composition right now. And I mean, end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I put on the field, but I'm just giving myself the option to find some 2-stars, like a Poppy. A Poppy 2-star would give me the option for Vanguard, Space Pirates, Jace. Fiora is, I mean, a little bit out there. I don't really know why I'd have Fiora, but I think I just kept her on the field because she's, again, another melee, so I can just shove her in the front line, and she can distract and buy time for my Graves. So first carousel here, there is 2 options for me when we get down to my turn. I either take the recurve bow or I take the Brawler's gloves. The Brawler's gloves gives me access to Thief's gloves, which are generally quite useful units. They're quite pliable and they can actually be really strong in a lot of scenarios. So I end up finding a Fiora here as well, and that is enough for me to take off the Lux. I just add a load of random 2-stars to this composition and it's suddenly become very strong. Actually, I then sell the Fiora immediately for Lucian, and that gives me the Blasters. So now I've got 2 2-star Graves with Lucian as a blaster. So we have the 2 blaster bonus very early on here with 2 very strong 2-stars. And actually, this is just giving me a really good platform to snowball with. Picking up the Lucian, I still haven't committed to Blasters totally because I still have that 2-star Poppy. But it really just depends on what I find. I find the Blitzcrank here, which is obviously very useful for Brawlers Blasters in general. And you can see I'm deliberating it because I'm at 30 gold at a very early round. And I don't want to sell the Graves, obviously. But what I can do is if my Graves or Darius's get a couple of last hits, and you can see right here I'm versus a very, very weak player with only 3 units in the field, and I actually end up getting the 1 gold from the Space Pirates, and I end up finding the win gold. That gets me back up to 30 gold, so buying the Blitzcrank in this scenario is perfectly fine. And that takes us over to the neutral round, and we're going to skip ahead a little bit now and talk about the mid game when I'm level 6 and level 7. So a lot of you might ask, why did you go for a Bramble Vest on Graves? Bramblevest is actually just a really good item. And I was thinking, well, maybe I can try a tank Graves game this time round. So I actually got a load of, from that round and the couple of the last rounds specifically, I got a load of defensive tank items that aren't particularly good for Brawler Blasters. However, obviously being so close to a 3-star Graves, I thought, let's play like a tank Graves Brawler Blaster, which sounds awful. And I think in practice it genuinely is quite awful, but it is what it is. That's kind of what I went for. I thought, why not? Let's talk about the composition that where I'm at right now. I've got Lucian, I've got Darius with Gwyncy's Rageblade. The reason I've given Darius Gwyncy's Rageblade is I'm going to sell that and give it directly to my Jinx. We're running with a Malphite, Blitzcrank, and we've got Ezreal and Lucian. So we've got 3 Blasters, we're waiting for Jinx, we've got 2 Brawlers, 2 Chrono, and we've obviously still got our 2 Space Pirates. But our composition is much weaker than it was at the start of the game right now. This is why I'm actually end up losing a couple of rounds, because I'm just not, I haven't really leveled up my composition to a good state right now. I'm level 8 very early on. I find the Jinx. That gives me the 4 Blasters. And now I'm going to go into like a corner positioning with Jinx. And what I'm going to do is obviously bring Blitzcrank a little bit further out to pull someone fairly close by. And I'm going to give my Jinx a Trap Claw as well. Trap Claw is a pretty good item on Jinx because it's going to block a spell that may attack her, and it will stun that spell user. So it basically keeps her safe from a particular, like a burst. Like, you know, an initial burst. And now we've got the 4 Blasters with the 2 Chronos and the 2 Brawlers. We're in a super strong state right now. We're actually in like incredibly strong position. We're obviously going to want to start to consolidate some of our units, and I'm on this carousel again. There are a couple of things that I can look to aim for here. I can aim for the recurve bow, or I can aim for the tier. And I go for the recurve bow eventually, just because the recurve bow does build into items that are actually quite good for Jinx. For instance, I could go Runan's Hurricane on her right now. I get the 3-star, I finally get the 3-star Graves, which is nice. But yeah, I can go for Runan's Hurricane on my Jinx if I wanted to as well. I'm now going to split things out and go for a more middle positioning. I'm going to put 2 Jinxes on the field. I'm going to pull Blitzcrank over to the corner to pull like someone of high value over to the corner, and this time it's actually going to be Lulu, who does end up polymorphing a couple of units, but it's fine because she polymorphs the Blitzcrank, which isn't particularly useful. And then no one really touching my my Jinx because there isn't any Infiltrator builds really in this game, and that's pretty good. I can just keep her at the back line. So finding Thresh here is a big deal too, because bringing Thresh on now means that I could go for the 4 Chrono version of this build, which would mean I would require a Shen. And what I would do is I would essentially drop, there's Shen, I would drop the Malphite for the Shen and go for the 4 Chrono version. So in this game in particular, I went for the 2 Brawler 4 Chrono version, which is very strong. I'm now looking for a 2-star Jinx as a matter of priority. But, you know, my Graves is actually doing some solid work. 3-star with loads of defensive tanky items. He's actually doing some solid work. So I don't think it's good, but I think it was quite fun in this particular game. So you can kind of see this is where my late game composition is. The replacements that I make at this point are going to be Lucian for Misfortune, and I'm going to replace, or add at level 9 a Kale. So let's skip ahead a bit further and talk about that when I get there. Okay, so now we're at the stage of the game where I've got the Misfortune on the field. I've added a Spear of Shojin to Graves because he has quite a high mana value, so Spear of Shojin is better than something like a Seraph's. And I have actually just added a random Thief's Gloves to Misfortune because it was the best item that I could give her in this scenario. And then I've got the Jinx with the Runan's Hurricane. So I did talk about adding a Runan's Hurricane to Jinx. We're now in the late game. This guy's got an Aurelion Soul with a Seraph's and a Rabadon's Deathcap, which is obviously very difficult to deal with. So as you can see, I've started to lose, and I was like, okay, let's add a Kale and give her the Giant Slayer, which I picked up from the neutral round. So basically looking to stack my Kale here as much as I can. What Kale actually offers is both giving the Valkyrie bonus, which is brilliant for Misfortune, but also she adds another carry potential to my team. So we went to level 9, we added the Kale, and now Misfortune with the Thief's Gloves. It basically depends on how lucky I get with those particular items. So in this case, I got some really good items on Misfortune, so that was perfectly fine. Final carousel of the game, and I am going for the Spear of Shojin. I think it's just the best item that I can pick up in this scenario, and I can add that to pretty much anybody. But adding it to the Kale is perfectly fine because it just gives her a bit of extra mana and lets her come online a bit earlier. We found a 2-star Kale, and this is essentially looking for the late game and trying to sort of to win right at the end. And you can see I'm just repositioning to try and beat this Aurelion Sol 2. This is the most important thing. The Aurelion Sol 2 is very, very difficult to beat, and you can see I basically positioned to try and deal with it the best I could. Luckily, my misfortune was untouched, and we ended up winning the game right there and then. So that's it. That's the game. If you guys enjoyed this, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you want to see some more longer form commentary from me, like full game commentary, I will also do that. I just want to kind of get through the guides. I think the guides are really valuable for newer players, and I kind of want to do the guides first and foremost, but I will do more long form content if you want as well. So cheers, guys.